Have you wondered what it's like getting to know wild horses and their families in one of the largest herds in Wyoming? If you have, then episode 11 of Freedom for Wild Horses, Tales from Saltwell's Creek, is for you. And let's get started. Welcome to the Freedom for Wild Horses podcast, the place to find out about wild horses in the American West and what you can do to help them stay wild and free. If you love wildlife, wild horses, and the freedom that they stand for, this show is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. Saltwell's Creek is a wild horse herd management area in southwestern Wyoming. In size, it's the largest HMA in Wyoming, with a total of 1,173,000 acres, of which over 724,000 acres are BLM-administered public lands. 72% of the herd management area consists primarily of checkerboard land ownership created by the Union Pacific Railroad back in the 1870s. It's a pattern of 1 mile square parcels of public land interspersed with 1 mile square parcels of private land. The Rock Springs Grazing Association, the largest grazing association in the country, owns 40% of these private lands and a large percentage of the grazing leases on the public lands. It is at their behest that the BLM has decided to zero out this herd because in the checkerboard area, it's just too hard to manage. Most of this enormous herd management area is gently rolling hills. There are also buttes and beautiful rock formations, tall ridges, Aspen Mountain, and Meller Mountain. My first memorable encounter with wild horses in Saltwell's Creek was in the spring of 2013, before the roundup in the fall. As I drove down a hill of bright green, I saw 2 families of wild horses near the road. There was a beautiful blue-eyed buckskin stallion with a wide blaze who made me laugh at his expression when cocking an ear back behind him, listening to another stallion. He had a large family of sorrel mares and a foal. When I encountered him again years later, in 2019, he had filled out and bulked up, and his family had grown. I learned that his name was Scarface. In October 2021, he was captured in the helicopter roundup, but was one of the lucky few stallions that were released back into his home afterward. He jumped out of the trailer and trotted proudly off, tail streaming behind him. In that spring of 2013, I visited several areas in Saltwell's Creek that were new to me, including Aspen Mountain Road, which leads up to the beautiful Aspen Mountain. It was an overcast day, and it had rained the night before, so the road was a bit sticky. I cautiously drove toward some horses I could see in the distance, but as I rounded a curve, I saw a lone colt all by himself next to a T-post. He was sorrel with a very wide blaze and looked like he was only a day or two old. The nearest wild horse families were moving away and not looking back. As I looked closer, I could see a circle of hoof prints and manure around the T-post as if he had been there going around it for a long time. He looked up at me, unafraid, seeming to welcome the company. I checked my cell phone, and I had no bars for reception. I had to drive back all the way into town to get in touch with Jay, the wild horse and burro expert who was in charge of this area. Luckily, I was able to reach him, and half an hour later, he met me in Rock Springs with a horse trailer and followed me out to the foal. The foal was still there. His head was down. No other horses in sight. Jay drove the trailer near him, and he seemed happy to see us. Jay was able to put a small halter on his head, and I helped encourage his back end to move forward to get onto the trailer, laughing as his back legs jumped up and down as he felt the rope behind him. He climbed in and stood quietly while Jay closed the door. I followed him to a vet clinic in town that the BLM often works with, and they said that they would be feeding him goat's milk, which works the best for orphan foals. They would feed him every 4 hours and watch him carefully for dehydration for a few days until a foster home could be found. I remember the very first time I saw the wild curly stallion named Bubba in 2019. He was a giant of a horse with huge hooves, a long, tangled, curly mane, and an imposing presence. He had a beautiful, shy, strawberry roan mare and a new sorrel colt. He watched the horses around him, and if any stallion got too close to his family, he would run at them, which was usually all it took for them to run away, and for good reason. The ground shook when he ran. He reminded me of the horses the medieval knights rode. But he was a gentle soul with his family, especially with his colt, whom he nudged gently to wake up when they moved to water. In this area of Saltwell's Creek, I saw about 60 horses all together on a hillside one day. In some herds, horses seem to like to group together, whether for company or for safety, and it was always enjoyable watching the families and the bachelor stallions interacting with each other. Bubba and his family were rounded up in October 2021, and he was one of the stallions that were released back into Saltwell's Creek. When they opened the trailer door, he and the other stallions walked out and turned toward those of us watching like they were having a casual stroll. I had to laugh. I had never seen stallions who were released from a trailer do anything but tear away as fast as they could go. Saltwell's Creek is home to many curly horses. They tend to be large, heavy, with easygoing temperaments, and their hair is hypoallergenic. They have a curly gene, KRT25, according to genetic testing, says the International Curly Horse Organization. Here's a quote talking about the Wyoming curly horses. The Rock Springs, Wyoming curly Mustangs trace back to the ranch curly horse, the Laramie Stud. He was bought by Isaac Newton Brooks between 1942 and 1945 from a horse trader in Laramie, Wyoming. The Laramie Stud produced Rocket, a curly, and they are the source of the Rock Springs curlies. The horses once belonged to Ike and his nephew John Knapp's and became part of the BLM land when they no longer allowed these ranchers to use the range freely for horse breeding, and the cowboys were getting too old to do the horse roundups anymore. The remnants of their herd became the BLM Rock Springs Mustangs, and the curlies trace back to Rocket and the Laramie Stud. I have noticed that there are degrees of curly. There are some horses, such as the stunning sorrel stallion with blue eyes called Jack of Hearts, who has an extremely curly mane, but not much curls on his body. There is the young red sorrel stallion named Cassidy, whose mane is very curly and his coat is extremely wavy, especially his winter coat. And then there are extreme curlies, such as the black stallion Mooney, who has very little tail and mane in the summer, and whose coat seems to peel off in the summer, and then in winter he has a very curly coat and curly mane. The only other herd in Wyoming that has curlies in it is the White Mountain herd. There are curly horses in Nevada as well, but they are quite rare, and they deserve to be preserved. I met one of my very favorite curlies 3 years ago in May. I was walking alongside a creek, watching the horses head to drink, and I spotted a little Cremello foal, so fuzzy that he looked like a little lamb. As I moved closer to he and his mother, who's a stunning buckskin curly mare, Cassie, I realized that he was curly. Wavy mane, wavy coat, small and precious. Even the insides of his ears had curls. I was immediately captivated. The stallion, Justin, was a flaxen-maned sorrel curly, and the other mare was a Cremello, and her foal was black. It seemed like the foals should have swapped mothers, color-wise. I named him Julian, and every time I visited the area, I looked for him. In the winter, his coat grew so thick and curly it looked like a rug. And in the spring, when he shed and slicked out, I could still see the curly pattern on his coat faintly, and most of his tail thinned out, especially at the top. That summer, when he was a yearling, he stayed close to his family. But the next spring, before he was even 2 years old, his father kicked he and his brother out of the band. I spotted them walking to a water hole one morning that summer, and he seemed to be growing strong, and hanging out with the other bachelors, even though he was on the smaller side compared to the rest of them. This year, he's 3 years old, much bigger, and coming into his own, leading the other bachelors. I wonder when he will start a family, and if he will get a chance to do so. In the spring of 2021, at dawn, I drove around a corner and saw wild horse families spread out on either side of the county road. And right in front of me, near the road, was a family of wild horses with a big bay roan stallion. I saw tiny black ears peeking up from the sagebrush next to a strawberry roan mare. And as I got closer, I saw a black foal struggling to stand. I realized that this baby had just been born, and I moved way back so as not to stress the mare. I watched from a distance as the foal got up and then fell back down a couple of times, then finally seemed to figure out where to nurse. Mom was clearly an older, experienced mare and patient with the little one. I moved across the road to watch some other families and to leave the mare and foal to get acquainted. About 30 minutes later, I saw the whole family cross the road, led by the stallion, and the little black foal was running to keep up, steadier on his feet. I could see the umbilical cord and blood down the mare's legs, showing she had just given birth. I was very relieved to see the little one keeping up so well with his family. In the summer of 2021, before the roundup, I drove on top of Miller Mountain, and several wild horse families were napping and grazing on a flat area with beautiful ridges and hills behind them. I saw 2 colorful families I had never seen before, and a stunning bay roan stallion had the largest family: grays, Cremellos, bays, and roan mares, and 2 youngsters. I watched him run and play with a couple of bachelors that were nearby before running back to his family. He and his family were captured and removed from their home and separated. But he was released and became one of the displaced horses dumped back out with other stallions without his family. In the spring, after the roundup, when I visited, I found him following a family closely, and there was a dominant Palomino stallion who was in charge. I wondered if 1 or 2 of the mares in this new family had originally been from his family. I watched him fight the Palomino stallion frequently, as well as fighting other stallions. And in the fall, he had a terrible injury on his side. A large square strip of hide was peeled off his side and hung raw and red. I hoped that he would heal from this injury. When I saw him this May, there was a large scar that had healed, and he was still following the Palomino and sparring with him. It is truly amazing how tough these wild horses are, with a deep will and spirit to survive and live free. My friend named him Valentino. Last May, I went up on top of the mountain before dawn, my very favorite time of day, hoping to get some beautiful images of the horses in the dawn light. I discovered a dramatic sky full of clouds, and the light began to turn orange as the sun came up. And then the horses started running and running. About 150 horses ran, first in a line in front of the sun, creating dark silhouettes. I saw families running with other families, and then they circled around and ran again, just for the sheer joy of living. At one point, I saw a mare and foal together, and I thought that represented the hope for the future for all our wild horses. It was one of the most epically gorgeous sights I had ever seen. Finally, the horses settled down to graze, and the glow in the sky paled, and I caught my breath. Later, they came, family by family, sometimes several families at once, down to the waterhole to drink and play and roll in the water. Last week, I met a new curly stallion, Blaze, with his family. He was a reddish bay with a stunning long curly mane and wavy coat. He looked fit and young, and I was sure that his liver chestnut mare was his very first mare. She had a long mane and a beautiful Cremello colt with a thin Blaze. There was also a Palomino 2-year-old who had not finished shedding out. I watched them in the center of a big meadow with many other families spread out all around to graze. He drove his family closer to me several times, and I wondered if he thought they might be safer away from the other horses. Then I decided to move away and let them settle down. The next day when I saw them, the Palomino 2-year-old was not with them. I wondered what had happened. Then I saw Silverado, a stunning silver dapple stallion, with his family nearby. There was the Palomino filly with them. She was Silverado's daughter and had gone back to her natal family. But then Blaze rushed in and drove her toward his mare and foal. Silverado did not fight him, but just watched. When fillies come into estrus for the first time, they find new families. I saw this happening with other families later that week. The Palomino filly seemed to settle down once she reached the liver chestnut mare, Genevieve, and her colt Saxon. Another new couple that I observed in May was the lovely blue roan mare Lavender, who looked like she had a spattering of white paint on her body. She was very curious about me and watched me, unafraid as I observed her. She was with a tall, reddish sorrel stallion with a very long tangled mane that I named Caden. They were such a cute couple, laying down together to nap. Then last week, I observed them after they had gone to the waterhole. There was a new 2-year-old pale strawberry roan filly with them, Cleo, and she and Caden lay down to nap in the sun, flat out, to present a lower profile to the wind. But poor Lavender was so pregnant with a huge belly that lying down looked like it would take a major effort. She stood there for a while and finally lowered herself slowly down. Then she tried lying on her side for a while, but was clearly uncomfortable, so she got up again. I felt bad for her and hoped she would foal soon. This herd is one of my very favorites, and it's a favorite with many people living in Rock Springs. People come from all over the country to see these horses, who are uniquely adapted to their environment. There are about 250 horses currently living in this herd, and so much will be lost if the BLM succeeds in their plan to zero it out. The Curlies are unique, but all the horses in this herd deserve to stay in their home with their families. The BLM contends that they are too hard to manage in the checkerboard and would rather pander to the demands of the Rock Springs Grazing Association and remove all the horses than work out a compromise. There is room for wild horses in this herd management area. They are not destroying sage grouse habitat. They are not destroying and degrading the range. I contend it is the thousands of head of sheep and cattle that are doing that. The lawsuit that has been filed by American Wild Horse Campaign, Animal Welfare Institute, Western Watersheds, me, Carol Walker, Kimberly Curl, and Chad Hansen to prevent the zeroing out of this herd and the Great Divide Basin herd must succeed. Once these horses are gone, they are gone forever, and their permanent removal will set a dangerous precedent for zeroing out other herds across the West. I will not stand for having my photos and memories be all that is left of this herd. If you would like to help save the Salt Wells Creek herd, please go to AmericanWildHorseCampaign.org and make a donation to the legal fund, or spread the word. These horses deserve to live their lives wild and free with their families. They do not belong in holding facilities or sent to slaughter. Thank you for listening to Episode 11 of Freedom for Wild Horses. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you want to learn more, follow me at www.wildhoofbeats.com for more information and for ways to help America's wild horses. See you next time.